There's this social psychological construct called self-monitoring, where there are some people who are more inclined to be the right person at the right place at the right time, and they will adjust to the environment that's around them, and they won't necessarily deviate. So, if it's the case where a person is raised in a religious family, they will subscribe to those cues.
Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gents, depending on when you're listening to this. My name is Gray Jabesi, and this is another episode of the Gray Ave podcast. And if you're listening to this podcast for the first time, this is a podcast about learning, really. What I do is that I find those people that you would want to talk to and learn something from. But you can't because you're busy with work and the everyday life, and these people are spread out across the world. So it's my job to go around there and meet and talk with these people, and then I get to learn whatever they are more knowledgeable about. So it's mostly related to business and technology, but these are lessons that you can apply in every aspect of your life. So it can be company CEOs, it can be scientists, or in all sorts of experts in different types of industries. Anyway, so today we have another exciting guest. We have Dr. Damon Bryant, and he is a business psychologist. So I'm just going to give you a little summary of what he does, and then we're going to get into the podcast. But this is definitely one of my favorite podcasts this year, I have to say, because I learned a lot. So Dr. Damon Bryant is a business psychologist with over 15 years of experience in data analytics and psychological assessment tools. Currently the CEO of LightPayCoin, a next generation crypto focused on digital payments in business and government. His expertise is in psychological and behavior assessments with an emphasis on AI-based systems and behavioral economics. He has derived mathematical information functions to quantify the usefulness of any observable behavior by humans or machines. He has also conceived and developed the internet-based smart test technology platform, an artificially intelligent assessment system. I don't know why I'm breaking there. I need coffee. And his research is published in several professional journals, including Applied Psychological Measurement, the Journal of Managerial Psychology, International Journal of Testing, and Psychometrika. Past honors include IBM's Young Innovator Award for developing human resource software for use in international markets, Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology Robert J. Wherry Award for research in the area of test bias, and a letter of commendation from the Louisiana State Senate for developing and administering an internet-based police officer assessment center after Hurricane Katrina. So he's a hell of a man, and I don't think this summary I just read does him justice, but you guys can definitely look him up. He's also an author, and I would actually recommend that you find his book. It's called Flow, an information-based theory of challenge skill balance. So I hope you guys check it out. The authors are obviously Dr. Bryant and his co-author, who he actually talk about in the podcast. His name is Larry Davis. So anyway, let's get into the interview. Some of the things that we talk about, actually everything surrounds the subject of psychology, of course, but we talk about psychometrics and behavioral economics, to be specific. So without wasting too much of your guys' time, I hope you enjoy this podcast as much as I did. You can also follow Damon on Twitter. His name is Damon Bryant, PhD, but his Twitter handle is at Dr. Damon Bryant, at Dr. Damon Bryant. So enjoy the podcast, and if you're new, remember to subscribe and give me a 5-star review on iTunes. Enjoy.
Man, just taking it a day at a time, trying to weather the storm, keep investors happy and calm.
Right.
as usual.
Yeah, the daily stuff. It sounds exciting. Where are you based at the moment?
Actually, I'm in Dallas, Texas.
Okay, you from there?
I was born and raised in Florida. And then I
Okay.
moved here when I married my wife and I. We got married. And then my first startup after I exited built my first startup here. It was an AI company, and then we've been here ever since.
Right, and it seems like you went to Howard University, right?
Howard University, yes sir. And that's my alma mater. Love it to death. I hated it when I was there because
Why?
there was so
There's a lot of great
it,
people who came from there. I mean, Sean Combs went there as well, right?
oh yeah, P Diddy, yeah, he was
Yeah.
actually on. He left the year before I came on campus. But even though he did come back with his little groups and when you had Biggie Smalls and all those other guys that he was forming at Bad Boys, so he did visit campus a lot. But I didn't like the campus because it was inefficient. And a lot of people would complain that it's inefficient. But after you leave and you was like, okay, when I reflect back, it's one of the best experiences that I had in my life.
Wow. Could you give an example of why when you think about it now, you're like, okay, maybe that was great.
One, it gave me a strong sense of self, understanding the people who attended Howard, the people who graduated and went on to do great things, the ability to build self-efficacy. And the scientific research shows this. People who go and attend HBCU for undergrads, they have the highest attainment of advanced degrees than blacks who attend primarily white institutions. And it has something to do with the water, I guess.
That's a very, very interesting observation, though.
Yes, that was published by the Educational Testing Service in Princeton, New Jersey, and the evidence is overwhelming. So people always ask, what's the value of an HBCU? You can look at the statistics time and time again. Students who graduate from HBCUs, students who are from the diaspora, black students, they outperform their black peers who attend primarily white institutions for undergraduate. So it's something about the level of self-efficacy, the ability to hustle, being gritty, navigating through a difficult environment. I guess in a sense, it hardens you up in a way to prepare for the real world. Even though some people argue, well, it's an all-black school. You're not getting that quality education of a diverse environment. Well, you have to work on yourself. And I believe that truly to really understand and reprogram like what's happened in understanding American history, where we fit into that context and trying to come into our full being. So that was one of the things that Howard, it gave me a great appreciation taking the class Black Diaspora and being forced to research your family history, even though I thought it was no big deal then. But as I began to dig more and more, I was like, wow, I have a rich family history and I didn't even know about it. But then I had heard bits and pieces as a kid, but I never really pieced it all together when my family would say, well, your dad was in World War II. And then I found my great uncle, he was in World War I and wrote a book. And my great great grandfather he fought in the Civil War and literally for freedom. So in essence, raiding slave plantations. And where I was raised, it was the case that we went ahead and settled, the black soldiers after the war, once Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox, they mustered those units out of service, and in essence those black soldiers end up settling on those base camps in the South where they were engaging in launching battles. So that's where my family, where I was born and raised in Orange Mills, Florida.
Interesting. I think I heard the same when it comes to HBUs. I heard the same sort of narrative from Dr. Sowell. Is it Dr. Sowell? I think he is. Yeah. He's an American economist. He's a very interesting Thomas Sowell. I don't know if you ever read any of
Thomas
his.
Sowell.
Yeah. I read one
Mhm.
of his books, and it talks about the university situation as well. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Sure,
So,
and a lot of those schools were named after Civil War generals. And as a matter of fact, I was named after my great uncle who died in Normandy, who was named after General Grant. So my middle name is Ulysses. So Ulysses S. Grant was one of the generals during the Civil War.
oh wow, I think your generation is still quite very connected to the war behind you guys. Very interesting break of history.
And I think it's important to know because it
Yes.
gives you a sense of self, a sense of pride in your orientation relative to what's happening today. Because in a sense, I think we're moving backwards to some degree.
Oh yeah, I can agree with that. And also, I think embedding a name like that historically, actually, it gives you a very sense of self to, like, it's easier to look back or to refer back to where you come from.
Sure,
Such
sure.
a small detail, but quite very important when you think about it. So let's jump into what you're doing now.
Okay.
When you go at a dinner party, how do you break it down? Like, who are you?
Well, usually at a dinner party, I try not to introduce myself as Dr. Bryant. So I introduce myself as Damon, and as the conversation moves along and as people attempt to gauge where you are in terms of your orientation, your socioeconomic status, and then that's when I begin to move. I'm Dr. Bryant. I'm a PhD in industrial and organizational psychology. I got my degree from the University of Central Florida and graduated from Howard University. But my PhD is in industrial and organizational psychology with a focus in quantitative psychology, which includes areas of psychology such as behavioral economics, psychometrics, and in particular, when we talk about psychometrics, then we begin to talk about intelligence. And also, intelligence leads us into not only human intelligence, but artificial intelligence as well.
Wow. It's fascinating, both of those subjects, behavioral economics and psychometrics. So let's start by establishing each one of those. I mean, briefly, how could you just run them through? What are they? Because I'm sure they will pretty much be most part of our conversation.
Sure. When talking about behavior economics, it's really an area established by two psychologists who end up winning Nobel Prizes in economics for their work on judgment and decision making. These two individuals, Kahneman and Tversky, one of the main areas within behavior economics is framing. How certain things are framed despite the statistical probabilities associated with those events. People respond differently based upon how it's framed. For example, if I had you to quickly respond to me about a question of going to a particular hospital, say you got injured and you had the choice of going to a hospital, and it was somewhat a life-threatening injury where you could live and you could perhaps die. And if I quickly ask you the question, okay, would you attend this hospital where you have a 50% chance of life, or would you attend a hospital where you have a 50% chance of death? Immediately people would tend to answer, I want to go to the hospital where I have a 50% chance of life. But statistically, it's the exact same thing. But it's just a matter of how it's phrased that individuals will respond differently on that framing. So that's one area of behavioral economics that really helped propel psychology more into the limelight of business, finance, economics, and just in general in making decisions, life-changing decisions, and even low-stakes decisions as well. There's another area of behavior economics where people use heuristics, and with heuristics, these are quick shortcuts that we use to make decisions. We don't put a lot of cognitive effort into it, but yet, for the most part, sometimes it's accurate. In other circumstances, these heuristics they can lead to very bad decisions and bad judgments. A third, and if we can, for instance, we can talk about some other areas of heuristics and attributions and how they actually play out in market decisions. And it's something that I noticed a lot particularly as I began to do work in the cryptocurrency space, founding LightPayCoin, also developing the LotusCoin project, is that within the member communities, it's the case that I'll see these attribution errors play out depending on the market price, depending on of a particular cryptocurrency on an exchange. For instance, the one attribution error that people make in the cryptocurrency space when making trades or watching a particular asset is in external attribution error. And a great example of this, and I was talking to the communities on a weekly basis. I give webinars and I try to give a summary around the statistics, what's happening in the community, and begin to talk about some areas of how the decisions that are being made by some community members and the claims that they're making are actually biases. And unless they have sufficient evidence to support it objectively, then it can be easily placed into a bias that individuals make. For instance, with external attribution bias, when a person engages in an environment or makes a decision, then they would observe how that decision plays out in terms of a positive or a negative outcome. If it's the case, for instance, if we were buying Bitcoin and we bought Bitcoin at $6,000, if the price of Bitcoin goes to $7,000 and you begin to say to yourself, hey, the price of Bitcoin has gone up. I like that. That feels good. That's good for me because I made a smart investment decision. All of a sudden, you're attributing to yourself that positive outcome. You made the investment at $6,000. The price went up to $7,000. As a consequence, you're increasing your self-efficacy, your self-esteem, and you attribute it to yourself. Now, say, for instance, you make the same investment of Bitcoin, you purchase Bitcoin for $6,000, and all of a sudden it goes to $4,000. Now, you see the price of Bitcoin drop. It drops. You're not feeling good. As a result, as humans, we attempt to protect our self-esteem. And because of that, we don't necessarily place blame immediately on us. We try to find other reasons outside of ourselves to say that's the cause of it. One may say, well, the government is saying bad things about cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin in particular, or it's the case that there are bots trading on different exchanges that's dumping on the price, and as there's some market manipulation going on. It's the case you're not necessarily blaming yourself for the decrease in the price, but in the case of increasing in the price, you attribute that positive action to yourself, that the decision that you made was a good decision. But in the case of it, the price going down, and you want to find some reason why the price went down, so you go blaming other things and placing it outside of yourself, and instead of saying, okay, it was something that it happens in the market, but yet I'm making these attribution errors about what's going on. But that's just another example of what's happening or give a general description of heuristics, attributions, framing, and also one of the last areas within behavioral economics is market inefficiencies. And we could talk about that a little bit later as well, because that not only plays into economic markets, but also inefficiencies within organizations as well. As an INO psychologist, one of the things that we look for or attempt to do is to apply psychological principles in organizations to make them more efficient and the people in them more efficient as well. So that's just one area, or a variety of different areas when you begin to break down some of the subcomponents within behavioral economics.
Awesome, incredible. It just looking at the crypto market and what happens actually perfectly makes sense. It definitely defines pretty much any token holder. They all believe that their token is the best, and when you make a good trade, you feel the best. Bad things happen. No, it's the whales and everything else. Now let's jump onto
no. I'll correct you on that one. It's the developers. They're taking the pre-mine and dumping on the market.
Yeah, there's always someone to blame.
It never fails. Anytime the price dips, even though we know there's huge amounts of volatility, but then it's the case, it never fails. Anytime the price is up, in terms of DMs or Twitter messages or emails, I rarely get any emails at all or any messages when the price is up and everything's going good. But when the price dips or there's a correction or some type of pullback, oh man, I get it. So I expect it. I understand it. It's an attribution error. So it's one of the things that I attempt to just rationalize with whoever's making the direct message or laying the claim, either in a public forum, on a Discord chat, or within an email. I'll explain rationally some of the things that I see happening, and then just walk them through the process, and then they feel a bit better. But it's the case. I know it's an attribution error, so I can deal with it.
Right. So let's jump into psychometrics.
Sure. Psychometrics really is an area that was developed to support psychological testing and measuring human intelligence. When you begin to talk about intelligence, you can find hundreds of definitions from hundreds of different publications and from different authors trying to define what is human intelligence. There's no agreed upon definition, but in general, it's how human beings would adapt to their environment to accomplish desired goals. And it's very general form, but if looking at the literature, there are some psychologists who argue that a good definition, even though they don't define really what intelligence is, they say a good definition of intelligence is one that is aligned with biology and how we evolve as human beings. Not necessarily saying that it's purely an innate or genetic characteristic, but it is one as we evolve and interact with the environment. So it's an interaction of both some biological characteristics and some environmental characteristics. So it's the interaction of the two. And you can see this when we study in biology the concept, or if some of you are familiar with the concept of hormesis, of how organisms adapt to their environment. And a good example of this within biology, when you talk about, let's say within toxicology, if I were to give you a medication such as acetaminophen, or another over-the-counter drug like ibuprofen or aspirin, if I gave you a little bit over-the-counter, you would take it and you might have a headache, and you take one, it doesn't do anything. Say it took a couple hours, you take two. Now you take two, and your headache is now being soothed by taking the over-the-counter medication. Now, if that is your body adjusting, the first time that you took it, nothing happened because it was low dose. It was low dose and still attempting to stimulate you in a way. Once you took two, it did stimulate you enough to soothe the pain. However, if I gave you an entire bottle of aspirin and I told you to take it, guess what? You're going to die. Because it's at the point where your body can't adjust or adapt to that much aspirin or ibuprofen being introduced to it at once. That external agent or toxin it's no longer beneficial to you. Initially, it's low dose stimulation when you're taking 1 to 2, so it's stimulating you. But yet, when I'm giving you too much, there's going to be some high dose inhibition. So it's the case that it's going to be harmful and it won't help you. That's just in a biological sense. Think about this physically when adapting to the environment. If you're trying to become stronger, going into the weight room, it doesn't make sense for you. Say we're doing a bench press or a deadlift. Let's do bench press, and you want to start out bench press 5 sets of 5, and you start out with, say, 500 pounds. No, you're going to kill yourself because you're not. Once you get it off the rack, it's going to press directly in your chest. You won't have enough strength to put, unless you're really, really, really strong and you have exercise and you're used to it. But if you're not used to it and you're someone who doesn't work out, that weight is going to hurt you really, really bad. It's like trying to run a marathon and you've done absolutely no training at all. It's going to hurt you. But if you started out with something small, say you did 5 sets of 5 of 35 pounds on a bench press, you can do that for a week and then move up 40 pounds, 50 pounds. It's that similar concept of adding a little bit more, a little higher dosage of the medication. So now you're adapting to the environment. That's we looked at it from a biological level. Then we looked at the example with lifting weights on a physical level, how you're adjusting and adapting over time and you're becoming stronger. But now from a psychological level, it's the same aspect when we talk about engaging in different environments. If things are threatening to you, it's the case you would attempt to withdraw from that environment until you perceive that you can attempt to challenge that particular threat at a certain point in time. So building your self-esteem, being able to accomplish goals one set at a time, and then entering into this optimal state of performance. Just like a particular drug, there's a certain point where it has its optimal level of impact in the body in soothing pain. And in lifting weights, there's this optimal amount of weight that you can lift. That's the maximum point of effectiveness from a physical standpoint. From a psychological standpoint, now we're getting into this concept called flow. Or it's the optimal state of engagement. It's the optimal state for learning, skill acquisition, and performance. And that's one of the things that we haven't necessarily applied within organizations at all. But when we talk about psychometrics tends or attempts to quantify these psychological characteristics so we can understand what are the maximum levels of performance where we can place individuals in certain roles and they will perform well. I know it was a long explanation, but just tried to give you.
Yeah, but I think pretty much everyone now has a very good understanding of it by now. So my question is now, like, how old were you when you developed an interest in psychology?
Sure. It really started. And as background, my grandfather, he was a minister, even though he died before I was born. But I had my older sister. She was born right after World War II. And it was the case that she was a psychology major and was also a minister. I took an interest in psychology at Howard University. I didn't have any psychology courses in high school, but I was influenced by this very popular, I didn't know he was that popular at the time when I was a student, named Dr. Curtis Banks. He was a Stanford graduate who was a professor at Howard. He was my psychology professor. And he talked about how people could change according to the situation and not necessarily driven or individuals being or changing their behavior according to their personality. So for me, taking that particular course taught by Dr. Banks, I understood that behavior is not necessarily driven by a person's or individual's personality. So if you think if someone's extroverted, they're going to be extroverted in a wide variety of different contexts. If someone is achievement striving, they're going to be achievement striving in a wide variety of different situations. Taking that particular course began to shape my perception around this is a young science. It's a baby science when you think about mathematics and how robust it is, or physics. compared to these hard sciences, psychology is very, very young. It gave me, and I began to think about psychology as an area where I could begin to make an impact. So Dr. Curtis Banks, just to give a little bit of background on him, he was the student of Phil Zimbardo, who was the American Psychological Association president, and also the lead author of the Stanford Prison Study. This is a course, or individuals in college, in their first course, if they take Intro to Psychology, they learn about the Stanford Prison Study, how situations and the context of a situation can modify or change an individual's behavior and how they orient themselves. People who are very normal, who are, say, nice or generally have a positive disposition, can be shaped, or the situation can be strong enough where cues are placed in the environment where they become hostile, very angry, very mean, aggressive, and antagonistic towards anyone who attempts to engage them in that particular setting, to the degree that those cues are strong enough to elicit that. So Dr. Zimbardo, this was back in the 70s when he did this study with my professor, Dr. Curtis Banks, in showing that personality is not the primary predictor of behavior. So now this goes back once again to that, how some part of the individual, how they interact with the environment, these two things combine to produce behavior. So that began to lead me into things such as social intelligence, general human intelligence, and how these things can be shaped within organizational settings to increase productivity. Understanding politicians, for instance. Politicians are very attuned to what's going on around them physically. Lawyers, say trial lawyers, they are very adaptive and great at adjusting, being the right person at the right place at the right time. However, there are some individuals who are more dispositionally driven and not necessarily situationally driven, but they're more principled in their approach. So they use their internal dispositions, their personalities, their values, their attitudes, and their beliefs to guide behavior. So that's when I began to look more into social intelligence, human intelligence, and really trying to put it together, because it's, once again, psychology is very, 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 very young. It's a young discipline. Very few laws exist. So it's the case. That's why I decided to move into the space, because I thought it was an area where I could make a great contribution, particularly in the area of quantitative psychology and psychometrics, because there's so many myths about intelligence and stereotypes about certain groups and how they perform, that totally, when you look at the literature and actually just the context of humans, when you look at the lessons of history, or there's a nice book, The Lessons of History, that actually addresses the issue, and it begins to turn some of the notions, what we think of intelligence and different groups on its head. But that's one of the main reasons why I decided to enter into psychology, because it was so young and could be like for a lot of innovation, just like cryptocurrencies to this day.
Awesome. And before I move into the next question, during your childhood, what did you think that you're gonna end up doing, or what did you want to become?
Well, during my childhood, I had no choice.
That's a very good answer.
Yes, my great aunt, my grandmother, she was born deaf, and she died when I was 6 years old. When I was 6 years old. My great aunts took over, her sisters, they took over and helped to raise me. It was the case, I had a sister who was attending Vanderbilt and was getting her PhD in business. And actually, she ended up becoming a banker, working for JP Morgan Chase and actually Wells Fargo at the same time after JP Morgan Chase. But she ran a little small bank in Chicago first before taking on those roles. But she was getting her PhD at the time at Vanderbilt. I had another brother who was at the University of Florida who was getting his MD. So he was becoming a medical doctor, and I had another, like I said, other siblings who were pursuing their advanced degrees. And my great aunt told me then, very young, you're going to be a doctor, just like your brothers and sisters. So at that point in time, when anyone asked me, what are you going to be when you grow up? I said, I'm going to be a doctor, just like my brothers and sisters. So it was a script. But understand the context. My great aunt, her father was born in bondage in 1864. In America, the Civil War didn't end until 1865. But it was the case, he was born in bondage. So having her father being born in bondage and understanding how far we had to go here in America, considering that we were not even considered citizens, but were considered property. That's something that it has an impact on you to be a descendant of a kidnapped African and be placed into the United States and have this second world or second class status. So it was something that I considered as being able to make the family proud, to establish ourselves as first-class citizens in this country, and once again looking at the family history and how we contributed not only to the freedom of kidnapped Africans raiding slave plantations during the Civil War, but also in World War I, great uncles fought at the Battle of Verdun in France. In World War II, my father was in France, in addition to another one of my great uncles who actually fought and died at Normandy. So it was the case, seeing that history and having that context and saying, hey, we contributed to America in terms of its perceived ideals that what we're striving for, even though America has a long way to go, even to this day. So I thought it was definitely a family obligation. In terms of the goals that were given to me, and I'm quite sure that they had some goals that were placed upon them because it was an obligation in order to make the family look good, make your community look good, make your country proud. So that's the case.
That's interesting that you say that. So you're very in tune with your history. I really admire that. Not many people that I've heard who constantly refers to history or their own history for that matter. So on what you said about intelligence and behavior, there is a lot of different research done upon it, or I think it depends on which fields the person who's talking is coming from. To a lot of people in the chemistry domain, they would like to say that, well, a lot of human behavior is driven by chemical reactions in your brain. And it's not like something that you can control. As much as intelligence itself as well, general human intelligence, whatever that means, since you also established already that, there is not a kind of a perfect consensus for it. How do you come to a conclusion? I mean, where do these two concepts meet in looking at the biological aspect of it and the psychological factor that you bring in?
Sure. And I'll go back to the example and frame this from the biology example I talked about earlier. When there's at the microorganism level, when an organism is or has been introduced to an external toxin, that external toxin can impose or stimulate that organism, where the organism will either absorb and engage in some type of reaction or behavior, or it can not necessarily react to that toxin. If it's not reacting, then it's what we call that low dose stimulation. If it's at the point where it's overreacting or it kills the organism, then it's high dose inhibition because it's toxic at a certain point. But at the lower ends of the spectrum, it's not doing anything to stimulate it. So using that biological concept to move forward, and you talk about chemicals from when you talk about neurotransmitters that are responsible for, say, aspects around learning and skill acquisition. The human is engaging in a process of intake of information from the environment. So there's an input, there's some processing that's going on internally, and there is a response. For instance, looking at a math question on a piece of paper, 2 + 2 = 4. Visualizing that as a student looking at a piece of paper, that individual is processing that information, which is causing some type of stimulation, the visual stimulation at the very bare minimum. And then it's the aspect where there's some cognitive processing going on, where there's either some working memory around the phonological loop or visual spatial sketch pad. And I'm right now, and I'm using a framework, a working memory capacity framework by Baddeley, when some proponents argue that working memory capacity is intelligence is working memory capacity. How much information can you process? How much information can you begin to combine to and reason with in order to make a decision? So it's consistent with that notion of chemical reactions in the sense that there's some processing of external information in order to elicit some type of response. From the biological perspective, you're looking at it from an organism. At this point, we're talking about a human being interacting with the external environment, say a math question, or being able to cross the street without being hit by a car. That's intelligent. If you can get across the street without getting hit, that increases your probability of survival. So now it's consistent with all three of those definitions across the biological standpoint, from the chemical perspective, and also from the psychological standpoint as well, when you begin to say, how do individuals navigate through their environment to become a leader of an organization to get a higher pay in order to increase the standard of living for themselves, as opposed to someone who would like to become a leader, they can't be a leader, or they're unable to become a leader, they're unable to get a job. As a consequence, they're making a very low wage, or they're making no wage at all, and now they're beginning to question their ability to survive. So now it goes back full fold to the original definition coming from biology, and even some of the concepts from Darwin's survival of the fittest. How do you adapt to your environment to accomplish certain desired ends? Does that make sense?
Yes, clearly. That's a very good answer. So then, from your aspect, from your definition or explanation, then I suppose things like you would explain in your psychological definition, then you define things like crime as survival of the fittest, which is Darwinian as well, eh?
And those are responses to the environment, and that because of the cues in the environment, those are the behaviors in which the individuals placed within that context. That's what they're using in order to survive, if that makes sense.
Right. So how do you define greed, for example? Because then sometimes, so in context of corruption, those are things that people do not because they're not able to survive, but obviously to fulfill some of the needs that they have. And in those positions, one could make a different decision. The same people of the same position could make a different decision on a certain subject. But one would choose to be corrupt and the other one would not to choose to be corrupt. How do you define those kind of biases?
So, and we can look at it from two different perspectives. Where it's a dispositional component, where it's a part of an individual where they have a high need for power. And power, you're looking at power, if you want to just define it in terms of position power, as, say, for instance, serving as a president of a corporation, or having influence over people who are able to make very life-changing decisions over others. Now, in that, looking at it from that dispositional standpoint, a person could have a personality disposition, a high need for power, or they could say, I would like to acquire power, and they take on this personality. There's a personality characteristic that's actually called Machiavellianism, where they're striving to accomplish their goal by any means necessary, even to the degree where it's not necessarily moral. but the ends justifies the means. In that sense, you have a dispositional or personality component that's driving behavior. Now, looking at it from a contextual standpoint or situational or interactionist perspective, there are certain cues that are in the environment. Say you have a CEO, this person might have had a very middle-class life, or even had a different, a low socioeconomic status, but they've moved themselves up through the corporate ladder of business and industry. But now it's the case they're in control. Because they've done all the right things moving into a position of power, and people trust them and they've given them the keys to the castle, now they have power that's unchecked. The context is something whereby the cues are in place. It's a very weak situation, or it's a strong situation where some board members may have taken them out to a party and say, hey, here's what we would like for you to do. We'd like for you to direct members of the team that goes out and checks the meters on the gas lines. And we'd like for you guys to, doesn't matter if it's up or down, we want you to round the values up for every measurement that you make. It doesn't matter if it's below, if it's 1.1 or 1.2, round it up to 2. Now, that decision is made, and that manager or that CEO execute based upon a dinner he's had with a board member. Now, individuals on the line within the organization, the accountant is beginning to see when you look at the P&L statements, they're beginning to see profits increasing because of these reports that are coming from the line on these gas meters, that individuals working on the line taking those measurements, they're rounding up. Some person working at the lower level of the organization is perceiving something is wrong. But yet it's the case at the highest levels of the organization, there have been directives given by the chief executive to execute and have this kind of unwritten business policy or rule about rounding up in terms of the gas meter readings. That would lead to an instance where the accounting firm is now thinking something is wrong, but nobody's saying anything. People within the gas organization, they're thinking, well, something's not right, but I'm not going to say anything. But yet it's the person there's been a context where there's power that has suggested an immoral act to take place within that organization.
So moving on, let's talk about, I think I'll ask this question anyway. I wanted to ask you also about, how do you frame a situation of two kids that were raised in the same family, same values, highly religious family, say a Christian family, and they grow up, go to the same schools, and at a certain point, one of them, decides to not become religion, say, consider themselves atheists, and the other is still extremely religious. What level of conviction can one have, or what are they? Is it a very personal thing, or it depends on what kind of experience each individual goes through to make them make any of those choices?
Sure, and this goes back to some of the research that I've actually I published within psychology. There's this social psychological construct called self-monitoring, where there are some people who are more inclined to be the right person at the right place at the right time, and they will adjust to the environment that's around them, and they won't necessarily deviate. So if it's the case where a person is raised in a religious family, they will subscribe to those cues. They will mention the values that are actually built within that particular cultural setting, either in their family or in their church. At the same time, there's another type of individual who's value-oriented. They could be placed in a context where their values may be inconsistent with what's in the environment, but yet they're going to execute according, or they're going to behave consistent with their values. Now, going to the situation where you have a family in which there are two kids, let's say one is value oriented, where their values that are taught by their parents and their attitudes, they've gotten that from their religious teachings from parents and also from the church. But then there's another family member in the same setting who's driven more by the contextual cues within that set, within a particular setting. So at home, at church, he's subscribing to the cues. But yet when you take that individual and say they go to college, or they're placed in a situation where they don't necessarily have those strong situational cues like at home and at church, then you begin to see them act inconsistent with how they were raised. But these people cognitively, they have no dissonance. They have no cognitive dissonance. They don't feel bad at all because they're disconnected from what their values, the values that they were taught, and the contextual situation in which they were in. So they can dissociate between their values and their behavior, as opposed to someone else or that other sibling who was value oriented. They may have a very difficult time going to a party or going into a situation that's conflicting with their values and their attitudes and beliefs. But in that same context at home, they act just exactly the same. This one child who is more principally driven by their values, attitudes, and beliefs, they're going to have some conflict going into some very questionable circumstances and situations. However, the other sibling is going to say, okay, you're a punk, go home. I don't want you around me now because I'm going to have some fun. And right now they're just falling in with the strength of the situation. It may be a girl that they like, a boy or a girl that they like, they would like to be perceived as someone who's cool to build that relationship. So it's the context of the situation that's driving them, but they have two dispositional components. They have a disposition called self-monitoring that allows one to be more value-oriented and value-driven and principled versus another one who tends to be more situationally oriented, flexible, and wanting to be the right person at the right place at the right time.
And on the other content that you've spoke about, like on psychology and anything else that we have covered so far, what books would you recommend that people read on, say, behavioral economics, psychometrics, and just good psychology books in general?
Well, if you're getting into the space and you really want to get into the technical components when we begin to talk about artificial, and you want to learn about artificial intelligence within psychology with computer adaptive tests, computer adaptive learning, it's important to learn item response theory. That's one of the theoretical frameworks that's used now to drive adaptive testing, like what's done at the Educational Testing Service for admissions to colleges and universities across the United States. And also with companies such as my old company, Lumina Datamatics Assessment and Analytics, where we provide recommendations for a sequence of courses based upon a student's level of working memory capacity, personality components, dispositional drive, their cognitive attributes, their behavior attributes. And we make recommendations on a sequence of courses, taking in their information about how much working memory capacity they have, how can they reason with abstract things or abstract situations. So, and once again, it's adapting, being able to adjust and adapt to the environment. And now we're building technologies to help people adjust and adapt to the environment. So I would recommend a book by a set of colleagues of mine who mentored me when I was a fellow at the Educational Testing Service at Princeton. Fundamentals of Item Response Theory, Hambleton, Swaminathan, and Rogers. It only assumes that you have a working knowledge of Algebra 1. Not very difficult at all, even though the proofs are quite difficult. There's another book that I would recommend that's It's very easy to read. Both these texts, you can get through them in, say, a day or so, a day or two. So it's like 150 pages. The other one's about 200. The second one is by another colleague of mine at Georgia Tech University, Dr. Susan Ibbotson. It's Item Response Theory for Psychologists. And once again, item response theory is one of the foundational theories used, particularly within the education space, for intelligent systems, for artificial intelligence and administration of tests, the artificial intelligence administration of a sequence of courses. It all goes back to item response theory.
Great. I'll put all those books and links in the description of the podcast on my website. Definitely everyone else can check it out. I mean, we could talk for years. You have so much knowledge and insights in all these things, but I don't want to keep you here. So thank you so much for your time. We can definitely do it again at one point. And when is your book coming out?
Oh, I already have a book.
Oh, okay.
Let me plug that one too, since we're
please.
talking about books. So the book that I've written was also by my co-founder, Dr. Larry Davis. It's on flow, an information-based theory of challenge skill balance. And once again, it reinforces some of the concepts I talked about earlier about being able to adapt to your environment. How do you put somebody in the flow zone so that they can learn most efficiently? How they could perform and be highly engaged in organizations, because we're not leveraging the science that we know within psychology to make organizations most efficient, more and more efficient. So that's a book that's written specifically for that purpose, to address some of the issues around flow-based design, flow-based engagement systems. They do it within video games. They have INO psychologists design mechanics to keep people engaged in video games, but we don't necessarily do it within organizations. And that's one of the books that I recommend as well. Flow, an information-based theory of challenge skill balance.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your time.
Great. Hello once again, and that was the end of our conversation. And just before you go, just want to communicate a few things with you quickly. If you have enjoyed any of the podcasts or this specific podcast episode, I would appreciate it if you share it with your friends and family through your social media, Twitter, Facebook, etc., as well as write me a 5-star review on iTunes or Apple Podcast app. That would be fantastic. It helps me flourish and sustain this podcast as well. We also on other platforms like SoundCloud, Stitcher Radio, and all other major podcast platforms. So whichever way you're listening to it, I would appreciate it if you leave me a review. You can also subscribe to the Grey Podcast through my website, greyjabesi.com, greyjabesi.com. There you also find some of the blogs that I'm writing sometimes, and you get notified as soon as the new episode has been published. Until next time, enjoy and be productive. Thank you.